Now, the earthquakes that devastated parts of Turkey and Syria earlier this month have claimed more than 50,000 lives and displaced millions. To make it simpler for Syrians living in Turkey to deal with the quake's effects back home, Ankara has loosened immigration restrictions. Our next report follows a man returning to Syria, this time for good.
Abdulhamid thought he'd be able to settle in Turkey. But the earthquake changed everything. He spent a week searching the rubble for his family and found the bodies of his wife, his daughter, and one son. His two other boys survived. After 9 years in Turkey, he's now decided to return to his parents in Haram in the north of Syria.
I crossed the border after I lost everything I had earned in my life. I lost my house, my furniture, and all my money. I slept in a tent until I had the will to start anew, to move on. Then I was able to take my son, who is 2 years old, and my eldest son and come here today. You're dead there and you're dead here, but here you have your family, your relatives. And this is what prompted me to come back.
But even here, his parents' home was also destroyed, so he and his sons will have to stay with other relatives for now.
I'm not planning anything right now. I can't think. I'm waiting for the situation to change and for God to send us relief.
At the Bab al-Hawa border crossing, dozens of buses arrive from Turkey bringing Syrians home. Thousands have returned to visit relatives, taking advantage of an offer from Turkish authorities that allows them to spend up to 6 months in northwest Syria without losing their chance to return to Turkey. But Abdulhamid and his sons will not be going back. They'll attempt to start over here at home, bearing the weight of their grief.
And with me here in the studio is DW's Beirut Bureau Chief Mohammed Trete. He has covered the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria as well as the Syrian civil war. How common is the story that we just saw?
Well, the flow of people crossing from, mainly Syrians, crossing from Turkey to Syria is quite noticeable now that there's these new regulations allowing them to go back to visit their families. But frankly, unlike Abdulhamid, a lot of the families that we talk to on the borders are not willing to stay in Syria. They just want to visit and, look at their families and just visit the area and then go back to Turkey. They said lifestyle in northern Syria, the whole life in northern Syria isn't good enough for them, with the lack of food, with lack of residents, with lack of medicine and clean water. So they will go back to Syria. Also, on another level, the flow of aid going into Syria is quite increasingly noticeable as well. But it's still not enough to cover the huge need in that devastated area. So to bring in more aid is quite complex. The UN said that the border crossings from Turkey to northern Syria are not enough to deliver the aid that is needed to cover the needs. But I'll tell you something. The area is still an active conflict zone, and people are still holding grudges. So some people we spoke to, they'd rather die rather than receiving aid from the regime side or from Assad.
Wow. So, the people who are then in Syria, how are they coping right now? Because, you have the description of the situation right now as being a tragedy on top of a tragedy. So, first dealing with the civil war and now this massively destructive earthquake. How are people coping?
Well, maybe they're not. I mean, a tragedy over a tragedy is such a precise description for people who've been experiencing multiple displacement. I think what is unfortunately keeping the people in northern Syria busy is the search for a tent on a daily basis. They go shelter hunting. Thousands are still living in their cars and on the sidewalks. They're just searching for tents, which seems to be quite impossible in the north. The situation goes even more complex now that the people are being asked to evacuate schools. Some schools has already started a class. But you see, the trauma of the aftermath of the earthquake is quite clear on children in schools as well. They feel anxious about anything, being in a classroom, being in a building. They feel anxious about sounds like the desks being moved. So they still didn't really cope with the situation, especially that aftershocks are still reoccurring.
How are people describing what they're living through?
Well, you know, I've covered the war in Syria, and I've covered the devastating Beirut port blast. The thing is, the people over there always had a clear enemy to express their rage at, to direct their anger towards. And that normally helps and speeds up the process of overcoming the tragedy. It's not the case in the people who lived the earthquakes across both countries. Like, people don't know who to blame. They don't know how to express their anger. And this is really slowing the process of healing, if ever possible.
Mohammed Shreite, our Beirut bureau chief, joining us now to describe the situation that Syrians are now facing. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.